Good evening, family and friends. Thank you all for coming. The topic of my lecture is entitled The Sephardic Journey, which is essentially twofold. First, I'll discuss my brief personal journey and experience, which carved out my current passion in Sephardic history and ultimately Sephardic Judaism. In the second Sephardic journey, I'll be going through Sephardic Jewish contributions throughout history briefly, and I'll date back all the way from Avraham Avinu, Abraham, until presently. I was once approached by a young acclaimed scholar, at least something of the sort, and we were discussing various topics of history, and then he said to me, I can count on my fingertips how many Sephardic rabbis there are in the past century. I was 18 years old at the time and very naive, and I immediately said to myself, this person is a complete ignoramus. I told him the following great line: good leaders will create followers. Great leaders will create great leaders. I told him I cannot speak on behalf of other Jewish communities, but I know one thing for a fact: Sephardic Jews created great leaders from the past and present. Naturally, having been raised into a very Sephardic home and Sephardic community, I felt that there was a very major void that needed to be fulfilled. I then said to myself, Im lo achshav imatai, if not now, then when? I noticed at this point the seeds of my career path were now being planted. The Sephardic journey or story dates back from the time of Avraham Avinu, Abraham. In the following excerpt from Chaim Raphael's historical explanation that during Babylonian exile, Jewish religious rituals, culture, and customs originated in Babylonia and spread from there to Spain, and not the other way around. This is a great historical misconception. Chaim Raphael says prolifically in his book, The Sephardi Story, a celebration of Jewish history. He says, the Sephardi world is an immense concept far wider in range than is indicated by its famous link with Spain in the Middle Ages. In one sense, indeed, the Sephardi story begins with the origin of the patriarch Abraham in Babylonia and the reformulation there of Jewish life at a later stage in Jewish history. The Jewish settlement in Spain was an offshoot of this, like I mentioned earlier. Avraham Avinu was born in the city of Ur Kasdim, which is in other words modern-day Iraq. As we move forward 10 generations, also Moshe Rabbeinu was born in Egypt, and as the generations flow through the course of Jewish history, the central geographic focus for the Jewish people was entirely in the Middle Eastern and North African regions. As Dr. Sarah Tayeb Karlin mentions in her book, The Jews of North Africa, when else in Jewish history have there been Jews called Nasi, including Muslim dignitaries who bow down to them? This is a great hallmark within Jewish history. The Talmud Bavli, authored by Babylonian scholars dating back 2,200 years ago, consists of documents compiled over the period of late antiquity. During the time, the most important of the Jewish centers were in various locations in modern-day Iraq. Within the academies of Surah, Pupendita, Neharda, Nisibis, and Machoza. These were the academies which ultimately authored the Talmud Bavli. The Shulchan Aruch as well, also known as the Codex of Jewish Law, is the most authoritative legal code of Judaism. It was authored by the famed Sephardic rabbinical figure, Rabbi Yosef Karo. All the rabbinical Sephardic personalities have endless names by the tens of thousands throughout the course of Jewish history, who committed themselves to the notion of religious writings and a dedication purely to Torah. Sephardic rabbis committed themselves to the notion that a vibrant religious life cannot exist without a real intellectual commitment and without a real experiential commitment. Pertaining to the territorial discoveries of the 15th century, Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and other explorers discovered great discoveries within Jewish history. Sephardic Jewish poets like Sholem Shabazi, Ibn Saruk, Yehuda Levi, Emil Lazarus, and so on. Sephardic philosophers such as Saadia Gaon, Shmuel HaNagid, the Rambam, Spinoza, Menashe ben Israel, and so on. The contributions of the numerous Sephardic philanthropists with the names such as Sir Moses Montefiore, Recanati, Cardosa, Sasson, Katuri, Sala, Taman, Dangur, Safra, and many others contributed not only to Jewish society but to the world at large. Pertaining to the arts were Sir Anthony Caro, Castell, and others. Regarding the world of politics, there are numerous names such as Sir Joshua Hassan, Sir Sasson Haskell, Navon, and many others. This list continues and continues forever. The list goes on and on. Although today there are two cultural Jewish groups, the Sephardim and the Ashkenazim, until the late 10th, early 11th century, there was only one category, the Sephardim, who were the majority until the year 1700, where there were 2 million Jews in the world, equally divided between the groups. From then on, there were more Ashkenazim than Sephardim. The flight of Sephardic Jewry is often overlooked. Many Sephardic Jewish refugees were created during and after Israel's War of Independence. Jewish refugees from Arab lands sustained incredible losses in a single generation. The financial losses were in the billions, But beyond that, irreparable damage was done to an entire civilization. Ancient Jewish communities which could trace their history back for 3,000 years were no more. The destruction of their civilization is a story that has yet to be properly told. This lecture is a step towards that direction. I'll never forget when I attended various yeshivot, and most recently Yeshiva University, my friends, colleagues, people who would tell me, wow, you're Sephardic? You're a Sephardic Jew? How exotic. The only thing many of them knew were food. And I said, there was more to Sephardic Judaism out of the kitchen. They asked me, what is Ladino? What is Ladino? And asked me if Sephardic Jews actually went through the Holocaust. And I said, of course, over 100,000 Sephardic Jews got killed during the Holocaust. There is much to be known within Sephardic history. Sephardic history is Jewish history. Ultimately, it is an issue at hand, and we all in this room, I feel an obligation to contribute to Sephardic Jewry. Everyone in this room particularly has to contribute, not just intellectually, but with many different approaches. I'll never forget that once I took a course in Jewish history at Yeshiva University on the foundations of Jewish education. And we were discussing who were the first Jews to have formed an educational system. So immediately I raised my hand and I said the following line from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth. And I said the following in class, where I concluded and tied it in with Sephardic Judaism and Sephardic history. I said the following: the Egyptians built pyramids, the Greeks built temples, the Romans built amphitheaters, Jews built schools. They need to defend the country, you need an army, but to defend the civilization, you need an education. I said to my professor, it was obvious, it was the Babylonian academies that actually conducted a formal, proper, and professional form of education. And I said these were the academies, in other words, also known as Sephardic Jews. And these were the ones that created the educational system. My professor immediately said, you brought up one of the best historical questions of all times, and then he just moved on within class. And I was a little frustrated, but it sort of got to me. Later I emailed him an excerpt from my introduction of the Ben Ish Chai, which emphasizes a lot on Babylonian historical documents and so on and so forth, and I mentioned a lot of it in my introduction of the Ben Ish Chai. I emailed it to him for his approval and his feedback, and I never ultimately got a response from him. Yet, ultimately, I was not surprised, but I moved on. This is a typical course in, a typical scenario within Sephardic Jews, always being ignored. Not always, but many times. So I said to myself, if we're going through these situations where many are being ignored, we have to ask ourselves something. We have to reaffirm ourselves. And I asked myself the following questions, which one of these questions stem from one of the great Sephardic scholars. And I said to myself, can Sephardic Judaism be reconstructed? And ultimately, this question doesn't apply to myself, but ultimately applies to the entire audience here. So can Sephardic Judaism be reconstructed? Is there a breakup of the traditional Sephardic world today? Are we more respectfully Ashkenaz today than we are Sephardic? Do we have an obligation to tell our parents' stories? Or were you going to be passive individuals, letting history pass right through our very fingertips? What about the world that once was, a world of Sephardic Jewry? An enriched history that shall never be forgotten. These are the questions that we have to ponder and constantly think about. Rather, we have to seek to revive the cultural heritage of Sephardic Jews as a means of strengthening Jewish identity, tolerance, and multi-ethnic awareness. As Michelle Dvorak, who is here today, mentioned to me, Sephardic Jews need to start asking questions before it's too late. And I completely agree, obviously. I ask myself on a constant basis this famous line, this famous quote, how can you know where you're going if you don't know where you're coming from? As the famed Danish philosopher, theologian, poet, social critic, and religious author Søren Kierkegaard said the following: life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. The world of Sephardic Jews is a world that we really often hear about. There are numerous external influences, both society and essentially other Jewish communities and branches, which do not allow the general Sephardic communities to progress and to maintain their exceptional identity. Who's at fault? I don't know, and I'm not here to point any fingers. All I know is that every Sephardic Jew has an obligation to know their history, to know everything about their identity, and to maintain, ultimately, their identity. Essentially, Sephardic tradition may be from the past, but it needs to be geared for the future Judaism, currently of the present, and as well as for the future, as I just mentioned. From my humble opinion, and perspective, Sephardic Judaism, if it is analytically studied throughout the course of history, one can properly see that it is a very balanced way of life, a very balanced Judaism, which is very rare in today's society, and ultimately is what we need in today's Judaism. As Professor Devin Naar said prolifically, there are stories to be told where there are documents to be uncovered, where there are experiences still waiting to be uncovered, recovered, and reclaimed. This is a great line, and this is something we have to take home with us and tell our children, that we have to reclaim everything. We have to recover and uncover the documentations. And not just the documentations, we have to uncover the past in order to bring it to the present. As Professor Daniel J. Elazar says, and he said it best, the revival of a Jewish living organic Judaism of this kind is the need of the hour in Jewish life. The best opportunity for doing so is through the Sephardic way. A major effort must be launched to reconstruct the Sephardic halachic tradition and make it a living tradition, with poskim addressing the great religious questions of our time in the Sephardic way, and as well as approach. The restoration of Sephardic modes of teaching and learning, and the establishment of educational institutions, particularly higher educational institutions, that will provide a home for those modes and train people able to express and continue the Sephardic way. All of this must be done through scholarship, but whether or not scholarship it should become part of a living heritage of the Jewish people is another question. These are the words of Professor Daniel J. Elazar, and no greater words can be told than this. We are no longer a footnote of history. Rather, Sephardic Jews developed, cultivated, and are the complete face of Jewish history from my perspective. May our Sephardic journey be a part of our lives and children's lives, so we can appreciate our culture and enriched heritage, which only contributes to positively furthering a relationship amongst each other and essentially God. Thank you very much.